Hello everyone. Today I'm going to present you with an analogy of the court trial system to explain the concepts and the process of hypothesis testing. Now, in any court trial situation, there are two parties. There is the defendant that is presumed innocent to start with, and then there's the prosecutor that claims that the defendant is not innocent, is guilty of some misconduct, some wrongdoing, and therefore should be pronounced guilty and put away. Now, just because the prosecutor says so doesn't mean the defendant would be put away, would be declared guilty. The prosecutor has to go through a process, and that is present evidence in the form of witnesses, documents, or testimonies before the court system, before a judge, before jurors. And if the judge and the jurors, after careful hearing and analysis of the proceedings, are convinced that the prosecutor has strong evidence, sufficient evidence, then they may declare the defendant guilty. Otherwise, the defendant will be declared not guilty. In the same manner, in a hypothesis test, there are two sides. One is the null hypothesis that is analogous to a defendant in the court trial situation. The null hypothesis presents the status quo situation. It is considered to be true to start with, just as the defendant is considered innocent at the beginning of the trial. The null hypothesis is also assumed to be true at the beginning of the process. And then the onus is on what's called an alternative hypothesis to bring strong evidence against the null hypothesis to declare it as incorrect and to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis. Now, just as the prosecutor has to bring evidence before a judge or a jury, in a similar way, the alternative hypothesis also has to present evidence to a statistician or a data analyst in the form of sample metrics, in the form of test statistic. So what is the evidence that the alternative hypothesis can bring to the table to prove that the null hypothesis is wrong? It is a sample study. It is from a sample study. So the alternative hypothesis will have to provide evidence in the form of sample studies, sample measurements, test statistic, and if the statistician or the analysts, after going through the evidence, think that it is strong enough, it is sufficient enough based on the criteria they have, they will reject the null hypothesis. Otherwise, they will not reject the null hypothesis. So that is how the hypothesis testing process is similar to the court trial system in many ways. So let's just recap what we just said. In the court trial system, there is the defendant, which is considered innocent until proven guilty. Analogous to that, in the hypothesis testing situation is the null hypothesis that is always assumed to be true. It represents the status quo situation. It is probably a population parameter that has always been considered to be true, considered to be correct. And then there is a prosecutor in the court trial system that goes against the defendant and tries to prove the defendant is wrong, is guilty, and therefore should be put away. Analogous to that in the hypothesis testing process is the alternative hypothesis that also aims at rejecting the null hypothesis in favor of a more recent study based on sample, and it has to produce evidence, a test statistic, and all the metrics obtained from the sample study. And if that evidence is strong enough based on certain criteria, then the null hypothesis would be rejected. Otherwise, the null hypothesis would stay as is. All right. So this is the analogy which will hopefully help you understand and relate to the concepts of hypothesis testing and its process.